When the judge said the name of the defendant in this case, something very unexpected happened. The entire courtroom stood up. But why? This is the story of a black homeless veteran who found himself on trial. Our story begins with a homeless man named Gary. He had served his country for many years, but unfortunately he had recently gotten into some trouble with the law. The 62-year-old man had been arrested after he broke into a house. Police caught him red-handed and took him to jail. He was later charged with burglary and brought before a judge. But as the judge read out the charges against the homeless man, it became clear that there were more charges than expected. It seemed the man's arrest came as part of a larger investigation into stolen mail in the area, and the police had discovered even more crimes linked to Gary. As each charge was read, the elderly man looked more and more shocked. In total, Gary was charged with 5 different felonies, including burglary, criminal mischief, theft, fraud, and possession of a controlled substance. Given the sheer number of crimes he was accused of committing, the judge didn't waste any time and ordered that Gary be held without bail until his trial. He spent several months locked up waiting for his day in court. But when it finally came, Gary never expected what was about to happen. On the day of his trial, Gary appeared in court dressed in an orange jumpsuit. He sat at the defense table with his lawyer by his side as the judge entered the courtroom. As the judge took his seat, the clerk called out the case and the defendants. United States of America versus Gary Grant. When he heard his name being called out, Gary's heart began to race. He glanced at his lawyer and then back at the judge. How is he going to deal with all these charges? He thought to himself. As Gary stood up from his chair, he noticed that all eyes were on him. People were pointing at him and whispering amongst themselves. Gary felt humiliated. He wished he could disappear. But before he could dwell on his thoughts, the judge spoke. "Mr. Grant," he said, "you are charged with 5 counts of a felony. Do you plead?" Gary looked up at the judge. He knew he was guilty of the crimes he was accused of, but he didn't know how to explain that to the judge. "Guilty," he whispered. "Sir, I am guilty of all 5 counts." The courtroom went silent. Everyone stared at Gary in disbelief. He couldn't believe that a homeless man would have the audacity to steal mail. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Grant, why did you commit these crimes?" Gary looked down at his feet. He didn't want to admit it, but he was desperate. He needed money to buy food and pay for a place to stay. Stealing mail was the only way he knew how to make money. The judge shook his head. "Mr. Grant, your actions are inexcusable. You are a veteran. You should know better than to break the law." Gary nodded his head in agreement. He knew the judge was right, but he couldn't help himself. He had no other choice. The judge looked at Gary for a moment longer. He wanted to give the homeless man a second chance, but he also needed to set an example for other people. If he let Gary off with a warning, it would send the message that stealing mail was not a serious crime. And so the judge sentenced Gary to 6 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. But he also gave Gary a lecture about taking responsibility for his actions. "Mr. Grant," the judge said, "you cannot blame your circumstances for your actions. You are responsible for your own behavior. No one forced you to steal mail or commit these other crimes." Gary nodded his head slowly. He understood what the judge was saying, but he still felt like he had no other choice. He was a homeless veteran with no job and no money. What was he supposed to do? The judge looked at Gary for a moment longer. "I want you to get some help while you're in prison," he said. "There are resources available to help you get back on your feet. I want you to take advantage of them." Gary nodded his head slowly. He knew the judge was trying to help him, but he wasn't so sure he could change. As the judge finished his sentencing, Gary felt a sense of relief. He knew he deserved what he was getting, but he had hoped for a lighter sentence. Still, he was grateful for the judge's mercy. He had faced up to 10 years in prison for each of the 5 charges, meaning he could have been sentenced to 50 years behind bars. But instead, the judge had given him a relatively light sentence. As Gary was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. Some people were staring at him in disgust, while others were feeling sorry for him. But Gary didn't care what anyone else thought of him, just wanted to get out of there. As the door closed behind him, Gary was taken to a holding cell. He sat down on a bench and put his head in his hands. He didn't know what the future held for him, but he was determined to make the most of it. He had made a lot of mistakes in his life, but he was willing to do whatever it took to turn things around. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to try. As Gary sat in the holding cell, he thought about everything he had been through. He had served his country with honor, but he had come home to find that no one had cared about him. He had struggled to find a job and a place to live, and eventually he had turned to crime, but now he had been caught, and he was paying the price. Gary knew that he had made a lot of bad decisions in his life, but he didn't hate himself. He forgave himself because he knew that everyone makes mistakes. He had made some really bad ones, but he was trying to make amends. At that moment, Gary heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw a guard walking towards him. "You ready to go, Gary?" the guard asked. Gary nodded his head slowly. He knew it was time to face the consequences of his actions. He had been sentenced to 6 months in prison, and he was ready to serve that time. As Gary was led through the prison doors, he could feel the stares of the other inmates on him. They were wondering who this new guy was and what he had done to end up in their prison. Gary didn't care what they thought of him. He was just focused on getting through the next 6 months. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make the best of it. In the following weeks, Gary settled into a routine. He woke up early and did his chores. He ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the mess hall, and he spent his free time in the library or the gym. He tried to stay out of trouble, and he tried to be a model inmate. But not everyone in the prison was so friendly. There were some inmates who tried to pick on Gary, but he stood up for himself, and they soon left him alone. After a few months, Gary was beginning to feel like he was turning his life around. He had learned a lot about himself, and he had made some good friends. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he was making progress. Then one day, something amazing happened. As Gary was walking through the prison, he heard a voice calling out, "Gary Grant." He stopped in his tracks. He knew that voice. It was the judge. The judge was standing there with a big smile on his face. "Judge," Gary said. "What are you doing here?" The judge looked at Gary. "I just wanted to check in on you," he said. "How are you doing?" Gary smiled. "I'm doing well, sir. I'm learning a lot here." The judge nodded his head. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "I'm proud of you, Gary. You have faced your mistakes and you are trying to make amends. That is all I ask of you." Gary's eyes widened in surprise. He couldn't believe that the judge was praising him. He had expected the judge to be angry with him, but instead the judge was being supportive. The judge continued, "I want you to keep up the good work. I believe in you, Gary." With that, the judge turned and walked away. Gary stood there watching him go, felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. He knew he had a long way to go, but he was making progress, and he knew that the judge believed in him. That meant more to Gary than anything else. A few weeks later, Gary was released from prison. He had served his time, and he was ready to start his life over again. This time he was determined to do things right. He had learned a lot from his experience in prison, and he was eager to apply that knowledge to his life outside of prison. As Gary walked out of the prison gates, he felt a mix of emotions. He was excited about the future, but he was also nervous. He knew that he had to make a fresh start, and he didn't know where to begin, but he was determined to try his best. In the following weeks, Gary began to rebuild his life, got a job at a local grocery store, and he began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. He also began volunteering at a homeless shelter, helping other people who were going through hard times. Gary knew that he had a lot of work ahead of him, but he was committed to making a fresh start. He had learned from his mistakes, and he was determined to make the most of his second chance.